In November 2023, on the streets of London, an elderly mother slowly pushed a wheelchair through the crowd. At first glance, it seemed like a normal scene. However, anyone who got close was overwhelmed by a nauseating, foul smell that made them dizzy. The police approached for questioning and quickly uncovered a horrifying tragedy. The passenger in the wheelchair was actually a decaying corpse, and the body's owner was none other than the mother's biological daughter. This shocking news was revealed by multiple British media outlets on February 10, 2025, causing an uproar across the UK. 77-year-old Joan Kathleen Turnell revealed during questioning that her daughter Tracy had passed away in September 2022. She had never reported it to the police, never sought help, and instead chose to let her daughter stay with her, even though her body had begun to decay and the house was filled with an unbearable stench. Joan and her daughter had lived together in an apartment in Leighton, East London, almost completely isolated from the world. Neighbours had grown accustomed to their silence, but over the past year, more and more complaints had emerged about the foul smell coming from their home, as well as the swarms of flies in the hallway. After several complaints, Housing Association staff visited the apartment on November 7, 2023. However, when they knocked on the door, Joan refused to let them in. To prove that her daughter was still alive, Joan made a chilling decision. She wrapped Tracy's body in a red coat, placed her in the wheelchair, and took her out to stroll around the nearby Walthamstow shopping centre. The Housing Association staff found this suspicious and discreetly followed Joan before calling the police. Officers eventually stopped her outside a Peacock store. "We noticed the person in the wheelchair wasn't moving, and the smell was extremely pungent. Definitely not someone alive," one officer recalled. When the police lifted the red coat's hood in a nearby parking lot, the sight left everyone in shock. Tracy's body was severely decomposed, to the point where her identity couldn't be immediately recognized, and only DNA testing confirmed who she was. When arrested, Joan asked in confusion, "Why couldn't they let us stay together? We've always been fine. I've always taken care of her." Joan was then sent to a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder and a brain tumor, with her mental state being extremely unstable. During the trial, the extraordinary life of Joan and Tracy began to unfold. Tracy, born in 1971, had a disability from birth: curved spine, damaged knees, and deformed arms. She relied on a wheelchair for movement from an early age. Due to her physical defects, she had few friends, never dated, and completely depended on her mother for her life. Even more shockingly, the mother and daughter had long lived outside the social system. They were not registered with a GP, had no government documents, and even lacked internet access, completely disconnected from modern society. The police couldn't even find a single photo of Tracy, eventually having to rely on DNA comparison to confirm her identity. It was clear that Tracy's survival completely depended on her mother, and her mother's world was centered around her only daughter, Judge Graham Irvine remarked. Psychologists pointed out that Joan's behavior wasn't simply a crime, but rather a manifestation of long-term grief disorder and pathological attachment. After a significant loss, some people become trapped in extreme sorrow, unable to accept reality, and end up taking irrational actions. For Joan, not only had she lost her only family, but also the very meaning of her life. Therefore, she chose to deny reality as a way to escape the pain. Keeping Tracy alive was not only a result of her dependency on her daughter, but also a form of extreme self-protection. Similar cases have occurred worldwide. For example, in Japan, an elderly father continued to prepare meals for his deceased son for a year after his passing. Psychologists say this pathological mourning phenomenon is caused by extreme loneliness and lack of social support. This is a despicable case, the judge remarked during the trial. Before Tracy's death, there were countless opportunities to intervene and offer help, but all of them were missed. Local government official Louise Mitchell later issued a statement. "This case is deeply heartbreaking. We must learn from it to ensure that such a tragedy does not happen again." In the end, Joan Turnell was not charged with obstructing a lawful burial. Due to her severe psychological and physical illnesses, the judge determined that she was incapable of bearing criminal responsibility. The cause of Tracy's death was ultimately ruled as undetermined because the body had decomposed too much, and the coroner could not establish a specific cause of death. The case has sparked shock and discussion throughout the UK. Some feel sympathy for the mother's deep affection, while others cannot accept her actions. In this nightmarish tragedy, perhaps the most heartbreaking part is Joan's final words: "I couldn't bear to leave her." However, this isn't an isolated incident. Similar cases have occurred before, drawing attention to the unsettling dynamics of grief, isolation, and psychological distress. In 2018, Florida authorities discovered a tragic and disturbing case in which a woman had kept her deceased mother's body in her home for years, pretending she was still alive. The woman, Mary Ann Smith, 60, from Florida, kept the body of her 90-year-old mother, Ruth Smith, for over 6 years. Ruth passed away in 2012, but her daughter continued to speak to her, kept her in a reclining chair, and even covered her body with a blanket to make it appear as though she was still alive. Mary Ann had withdrawn from society, living in isolation. She had no phone, rarely interacted with neighbors, and her mother's death had caused her profound grief. At first, neighbors believed Ruth was simply bedridden due to illness, but over the years, they noticed strange behaviors. Mary Ann stopped answering the door and avoided making eye contact. It wasn't until a neighbor finally noticed a foul odor and notified authorities that they discovered Ruth's mummified body, which had been heavily decomposed but was still in the chair with her daughter's constant care. The cause of death was never fully determined because of the state of the body, but it was clear that Mary Ann had been living in a state of profound grief and psychological distress. When arrested, Mary Ann claimed she was simply continuing to care for her mother and had trouble letting go. In a quiet neighborhood in Japan, Kiyoshi Ota, an elderly man, lived alone with his grief after the death of his beloved wife, Yukiko. Married for over 40 years, the couple had built a life together, and when Yukiko fell ill and passed away, Kiyoshi was unable to let go. For a full year after her death, he continued to care for her, as if she was still alive. Every day, he cooked her meals, set a place at the table for her, and placed fresh flowers by her side. He would talk to her as though she could respond, refusing to accept that she was gone. His family and neighbors had become concerned after noticing that Kiyoshi had grown increasingly reclusive. He refused to allow visitors into his home, and his emotional state seemed to deteriorate. Eventually, a concerned neighbor reached out to the authorities, and when they arrived at Kiyoshi's home, they were shocked to find Yukiko's body still sitting in a chair, covered with a blanket, as though she were merely sleeping. Kiyoshi explained that he couldn't bear the thought of being separated from his wife. The pain of her absence was so overwhelming that he had to keep her close, even in death. His attachment had become pathological, preventing him from accepting her death and leading him to an unhealthy, delusional state. In California, a similar yet equally disturbing case unfolded in 2019, when 57-year-old Diane was discovered living with her deceased mother, Clara's body for years. Clara had passed away in 2012, but Diane could not bear to part with her mother. For several years, Clara's body remained in a recliner in the living room of their home, preserved and propped up as if she were merely napping. Diane continued to speak to her mother every day, set the table for meals, and carry on with their usual routines as though nothing had changed. Neighbors had become increasingly alarmed by a strange, unpleasant odor coming from the house and reported it to the authorities. When officials arrived, they found Clara's body in an advanced state of decomposition. Diane was living in near-total isolation, rarely leaving the house and refusing to allow anyone inside. She hadn't answered phone calls in years, and it was clear that she had stopped seeking medical care. When questioned by the authorities, Diane admitted that she couldn't let go of her mother. She believed that if she just waited long enough, Clara would come back to life. Diane had never sought any form of therapy for her grief, instead choosing to keep her mother's body as a way of holding on to the past. This unhealthy attachment prevented her from processing the reality of Clara's death. These real cases reinforce the idea that grief, when unaddressed, can spiral into pathological behaviors. Forgiveness, both from a societal perspective and an emotional one, becomes an important theme in each of these stories. The individuals involved often didn't act out of malice, but instead out of deep emotional suffering. They were living with unhealed wounds, and their actions were ultimately the result of social neglect, the failure of a system to intervene and provide proper mental health care or social support. From a spiritual standpoint, we could view these acts as lessons in the dangers of attachment and the suffering that can arise from it. In all of these cases, the individual's inability to let go of their loved ones might be seen as a spiritual lesson about the necessity of releasing attachments to the material world. Perhaps these individuals, through their suffering, had to learn that true peace comes from accepting the impermanence of life. In the end, forgiveness can play a key role in both the healing of the self and the reintegration of a person into society. That's why, in spiritualism, we stress the importance of acceptance and letting go of attachments. Be an experiencer, not a dweller. As the wisdom goes, don't build a house on a bridge, because the world is a bridge, transitory, not eternal. If you're suffering from grief or loss, we suggest reading Dr. Michael Newton's book, Journey of Souls, which focuses on past life regression and delves deeply into themes of death, grief, and comfort. One of the fascinating stories in the book is about a man who was discovered through regression, living an isolated life hundreds of years ago, tried to communicate with his deceased wife. Due to his extreme isolation and focus on her, his mind may have tuned into the spiritual realm, allowing him to connect with her by looking into the mirror and focusing energy into it. By doing that, he could see her mirage in the mirror and talked to her telepathically. It's a captivating read, and if you or anyone you know is going through something similar, it might be worth recommending. So what are your thoughts on these stories? Feel free to share anything that comes to your mind.